Earthworm Jim 3D. What can we say about this game? It came out in 1999, it's hard to play, the story is confusing, and it was a waste of potential for a 3D game. But it's still a great game, but fans are still wanting to play the beta version of the game. I'll explain why, but I'll also be explaining some depth into the game's cut content and early development. Alright, let's talk about the 1997 version of the game. Announced around either March or May of 1997, the plot of the game would have been really strange according to an article from around that time. The plot of the game was to be that Earthworm Jim was at a zoo dealing with penguins before getting knocked unconscious, causing him to go into a dreamlike state, which he would have ended up exploring certain parts of the island that he would have been inside of that were made from parts of his brain in order to wake himself up, and most importantly, stop a bunch of terrorists from using a nuclear device. Yes, you heard me right. That was the original plot for the game back in 1997. It's crazy to hear that. The island that you would have been exploring are made out of the following: athleticism, aspiration, dream, fear, fetish, greed, lust, memory, and violence. Yes, those were all planned to be part of Earthworm Jim's brain, and I'm going to explain these parts and what we know about it. Athleticism would have been sports-themed areas, one of them being a basketball court and a bowling alley, that would have had Bob the Goldfish as a potential boss, since it seems like he would have controlled the area. Well, also at the same time, there's also images of Psycho and Professor Monkey for a head. Dr. Monkey for a head. Wearing sports gear, so it's unknown if they would have been bosses for the stage or if they were meant to be in the level. But also, childhood was meant to have a lab in it. Fear was apparently going to have a purple and green grassy area that the player would have explored, and it could be seen in some screenshots and footage from 1998. Here's a couple screenshots of several areas in the game that are kinda unknown, those being an area with a strange box, an area that looks like an early version of the barn area from the memory stage of the final game. There also was planned to have a house level in the game that would have an open world-like thing, allowing you to freely explore the level. Speaking of that, here's the only image of lust. And when I mean that, I mean the only image that we know of. That would have been part of Lust, and it shows a shower from a motel. I wonder why there's soap on the ground. Also was meant to be a western level that was most likely an early version of Fantasy, I don't really know, and an early version of Happiness, which looked a bit more different than the final game. Here are a couple more screenshots of some unknown areas of the level that look like an early version of Physical, which might have been scrapped, more on that later. There also was going to be a ski stage in the game that was meant to be a mini-game. This was reworked into porkboarding, more on that later, and also there's a track of the game that was unused known as Ski Gym, and that could have been played in the stage. Here's a snippet on how it would sound like. Also, look at this early HUD. It looked like it would have been a strange 3D render, and it seems like the main collectibles would have been brains, and also purple cells for some reason. I'm guessing these were supposed to be brain cells before they changed it to marbles as the whole "you lost your marbles" joke. And also the game was meant to have a 2D but 3D look and feel, and also it had statues representing every area / world for each part of Jim's brain. There was also a couple of cut kits from this version of the game. The following is a scarecrow with a missile launcher, a rabbit named Rabbit. It would have been a parody of Norman Bates from the 1960 slasher film Psycho, and a lobster in a mafia suit. Also, an early version of the Disco Zombies called Zombie Elvis. Is this what GTA 3 was talking about? Alright, now let's talk about the 1998 version of the game, aka the one that we're all somewhat familiar with when it goes to beta development. Alright, so the plot of the game is identical to the final game, where a cow falls on Jim and he is sent to a hospital and he ends up going inside of a coma and he must wake himself up. So the game would have had 6 parts of Jim's brain to explore: fear, happiness, fantasy, aggression, physical, and childhood. The one thing that some Earthworm Jim fans would have liked and went crazy for that was meant to be in this version of the game is that the game would have had around 30 levels planned. In the final game, we only got 4 worlds and a total of 10 levels. Hub, aka the brain area, looks kinda different from the final game, in this case drastically different. In the middle of the hub, there's a tank with a green ooze and a pig floating in it. In the final game, there's just a little tiny screen with Peter's head inside of there, and also at the same time there's different rooms where all the other certain parts of the brain is in, where in the original version of the game, there would have been multiple platforms with different names to sections of the brain. Earthworm Jim would stand inside of them as it would fill with some sort of green ooze and suck them into the pipes, as we've got a potential loading screen of Earthworm Jim bumping into these pipes. In the final game, it's just a platform Earthworm Jim stands on, he pulls out a golden udder, plays it like if it was a bagpipe in order to make the platform go down, encountering the cows that are also there, and that would serve as kind of like a level select. So apparently in some of the worlds there would have been one main level you would spawn into that would have served as like level select, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Now, for the stages of the game. Happiness plot would have been that Earthworm Jim was going on a quest to save the ultimate burger recipe from getting in the hands of Fatty Roswell and his food chain group. Here's early screenshots of the stage that look familiar to the final game but also very different, and also a early shot of Fatty Roswell's restaurant. Fantasy would have been similar to the final game, that being Earthworm Jim as a sheriff and having to defend a town. In this case, several concept art of the grannies with guns and stuff. Not that much screenshots of the game has been found, but just the concept art. Aggression's story would have been Earthworm Jim getting tossed into a war between cows and pigs, some chickens, and if you're wondering why this sounds familiar, that's because the plot/area was actually turned into the memory stage for the final game, but with a few alterations, like Earthworm Jim's being tossed into it being part of literally his childhood, even though he was literally created from a suit. Childhood's plot would have been Earthworm Jim going to a carnival located on an ocean pier while having to stop a nuclear device from activating it. The plot is similar to the 1987 version of it, and also not that much is known about it other than these screenshots, and look like they reused some areas from the 1987 version, in this case the Bob's Bowling area. Physical's plot would have been that Earthworm Jim would have battled two goddesses at the kitchen surface, Solblexis and Domesity. This would have been the first world/area the game the player would have explored, and a level being located inside of a store with a cow that's on a skateboard, and it would have had a Greek-like elements to it. In the final game, some of these elements were reused for Earthworm Jim's stage in the final boss fight. Fear's plot would have been that areas from a horror game and horror movie cliches like Nightmare on Elm Street, and Disco area looks a bit identical to the final one, but with some changes like the Disco zombies looking different, and also Evil the Cat was originally going to be the main boss of the stage, which would have made sense since Evil the Cat is, how do I say this? He has a throne in heck, if you know what I'm trying to say. Oh, Professor Milky for a head, it just didn't make no sense. Speaking of horror movies, one of the stages that would take place would have been inside of a movie theater with a huge Evil the Cat standing on top of it, and was most likely one of the starting points for one of the levels. Anyways, one of them would have been inside of a motel bathroom, just like the last stage, but instead it would have been a pork boarding level where you had to race to the exit while dodging knives. This is most likely a reference to Psycho. Speaking of pork boarding, let's talk about that. Pork boarding was actually going to be a minigame in some levels. That's right, you heard me. We were originally going to get it as a minigame, not a boss fight. This would have made the game much, much more better, because we were meant to have actual boss fights, and not a game of pork boarding while you collect marbles, while you get mad and spend hours and hours playing the boss fight, to the point where you just want to grab your Solar Rig manga and throw it at Earthworm Jim. Rocket Rocket was meant to be a racing minigame in some stages of the game, mainly physical, where we have items to collect, certain things to go through, and also a fuel system. The final game, lives would have been given to the player after picking up these little tiny heart things, where in the 1998 version, according to beta footage, cows were meant to be the lives, and the player, if they shot one, they would get an extra life. I could see why this was changed in the final game. Whipping / swinging would have been in the game, but there's rarely any evidence of this, minus literally them mentioning in some early versions of the game. Each level would have been split up into multiple stages, unlike the final game where it's a whole huge area you would have to explore, like Mario 64. In the original version of Earthworm Jim Dirty, it would have had a certain amount of stages in a level, like 2 stages out of 1 out of 5, or 1 stage out of 3 stages, etc. So brain cells that were later changed into marbles, and there was going to be a certain amount in each stage. For example, 0 out of 25, 0 out of 10, etc. before it was changed into 100 marbles in the game. By far, this was the one change that I felt like could have made the game even better, since collecting all 100 of those marbles are a pain, especially if you literally die. The ring ding, the ding in the New Junk City level, was originally meant to appear in the physical stage before this stage was entirely cut from the game. There also was meant to be a couple more weapons in the game, plus some early versions of some of the weapons from the game. Here's the concept art of what was shown in a magazine from 1987, and some of these were still in the final game. The concept weapons include the pacifier, the hairdryer gun, the shrinkway, the tadpole gun, the rotten egg gun, most likely changed to the eggs.
Eggs! Eggs!
E-double-G-S eggs!
The freezer, a pixel thrower which seemed to have an altered design for the final game. The gnome gun, which is still in the final game. The flamethrower, which was meant to be in the game according to some footage and screenshots before being cut from the game, but it's still in the game files via a debug menu. The false teeth gun? The handheld missile, which was most likely reworked for the final game. And the bubble gun. Just like the flamethrower, this is still in the final game, but you have to use a debug menu in order to hack it into the game. And the HUD would have been 3D animated, like of Earthworm Jim's head, similar to Earthworm Jim 2, but whenever you would do something, it would do certain things, similar to the Doom Guy head from the Doom games. Since the flamethrower makes several appearances in different stages, like happiness and physical, it was most likely gonna be Earthworm Jim 1 and 2, where the player could carry all the guns on them and maybe even switch them to certain areas. This was most likely cut in order to make them exclusive to certain levels of the game, but that's just my theory about why it's seen in a lot of beta screenshots and footage. Version of the game was pushed to spring of 98 before being pushed to summer of 98, then being pushed to fall of 98, then being pushed to winter of 98, and then being pushed to spring in 99, due to the fact that the game couldn't fit on an N64 cart, and also the Sony PlayStation version of the game was cancelled. Alright, so I know many people are going to comment on my video on why did I not do a whole analysis on the 1999 version compared to the final version of the game, and that's because there's not that much to talk about, since a few differences, like Earthworm Jim having a different model, dumb displaying, the marbles, Earthworm Jim still using early animation from the 1988 version, a few minor tweaks to some of the levels and a different death animation, but there's just not that much stuff to go off of. It's still similar to the final game, which is only a couple differences that were made in it. So sorry if I don't do that, but here's one thing I do want to talk about that is interesting. In early promos for Earthworm Jim 3D, you can see that it's listed that there was a Game Boy Color version of the game. In this case, it can most likely be talking about Menace to the Galaxy. But I have a theory to suggest that, what if Menace to the Galaxy was actually meant to be an early version of Earthworm Jim 3D? I know it sounds strange since the plot of the game would have been, eBay? The game does have some similar stuff than being a collectathon. Some of the areas of the game, like the graveyard, the lab, and the house, were all meant to be in Earthworm Jim 3D before they were cut. So this may or may not have been a portable version of Earthworm Jim 3D before they decided to make its own spin-off game after the game was altering and changing. But that's just a random thought that I thought about. Whew. Thank God I didn't say the whole thing.